No, it's a good question. I'm glad you compared it to Iran because I think well, part of the problem we had now in the unipolar moment, that is the liberal hegemon over the past 30 years, is war took on a very different meaning. That is, wars are something fought in other places. It's not on our own soil. It's something you see on the TV screens, and you can complain about perhaps some collateral damage, but it's not the war that the generations before us experienced. And I think also the wars over the past 30 years, we've had complete, I mean, NATO had complete and total um, escalation control. That is, so we can decide when the war begins. For example, so the war against Iraq, the US can position all its troops surrounding Iraq, essentially shape the battlefield exactly the way they want it, because they know Iraq wouldn't dare to attack them before they choose to start the war. So the Americans decide when to start the war. They decide essentially what is allowed to, which parts should be part of this war. They isolate they isolate the target, so make sure not for the war to spread without all uncontrolled. You can also see that if they want to end it, they decide when it ends as well. I think what like you compared it to Iran was this kind of showed that we're entering a very new era. That is, when the war began, especially in February, the Americans were saying, well, they're not supposed to strike our bases of the region. That's that wasn't part of the rules. Also, you can't attack the allied states or punish them by striking airports or energy facilities. Also, you can't strike or close down the Strait of Hormuz, and it's assumed now that the war is over, you have to reopen it. As if they get to decide. And again, I think this is the problem, this illusion of escalation control. I've said it many times. I think this is what's going to put us into war, because the assumption that one can control the situation. And this is another thing. I think once those missiles from the European states begin to enter into Russia, and Russia actually decides to retaliate with conventional weapons, at first at least, at that point, no one will have any escalation control anymore. It's going to spin out of control immediately. But that's also why I want to ask you, how do you see this war being fought? Because it seems as if the Russians have been fairly restrained. They've been very systematic. They have this gradual fighting along the front lines where they try to, bleed out the adversary. But I often get the impression that this is the assumption the European leaders had. They join a war for Russia. We will send our troops and our fighters into Ukraine, and this will be our battlefield. So the war will still be in Ukraine and in Russia. But again, we were not going to have war on our territory. This is kind of the assumption. I just don't think people understand what this war would actually look like. Again, I think the Russians would treat the Ukrainians much better than they would, especially the Western Europeans, if we get more involved in this war. But how do you see the war being fought, I guess?
I think it's a really good question. I mean, I think I think you're right. I think there's a general assumption that the war could be contained in Ukraine, and I think that's a very dangerous assumption, because I don't believe it. I mean, I think that I introduced the article by talking about a scholar a general whose work you and I both know very well indeed, General Karl von Clausewitz, who is war's greatest philosopher. And what he says is that the most important judgment that a statesman and a military man must make is the nature of the war. And I think that the Europeans have, and indeed the Americans, have completely misunderstood. I'm sure some do, but it's our leaders, and that's who matter, and misunderstood the nature of this war. They don't understand that for Russia, this is viewed as existential. I mean, it's only recently that Kaya Kallas said that we must seek to break up Russia. So what are the Russians to think if the Europeans' foreign policy chief says that we must break up Russia? So as far as Russia is concerned, this is existential, which means that Russia is fighting, as far as it's concerned, for its survival. And this probably extends back as far as the Rand article, Glenn, in 2018, I think, extending Russia, which talked about a war, or certainly this sort of process. But the way the war would be fought, I think, would be that the Russians would not seek any offensive operations other than those that they're committing in or undertaking in Ukraine. I think they would sort of continue to seek to actually secure those parts of Ukraine, but otherwise they would sit back behind their lines, knowing that all they have to do, pretty much like the Iranians, Glenn, is to defeat any attacks. And if you think about it, that's pretty much what they did in the first year of the war, when they did a strategic withdrawal in what I think is phase 2 of their strategy. Went and then were sitting behind the Surovacan line whilst they developed and industrialized, or mobilized, I should say, because they realized that they had to conduct a war. And behind that line, they then conducted what I call attritional defense, which is that actually whatever the Ukrainians threw at them, they destroyed. And they did destroy it. They destroyed not one, but 2 army groups. So I suspect that this will not be a question of Russian tanks rolling westward because there's no desire for them to do so. Rather, it's a question of the Russians seeking to defend themselves. I'm sure that there will be a reinforced Surovacan line, which runs from the Black Sea all the way up to the border with Norway and Finland. So that, again, it's a defensive war, and the way that they would prosecute it is the same way that the Iranians have prosecuted their war against the US and Israel. And I think what we would quickly find is the same thing that the Americans have found, which is that land bases are vulnerable. And we know that the Americans have actually withdrawn from the Gulf, largely speaking, because they can't defend their land bases. We in Europe in particular have very, very limited defense against ballistic missiles, and no defense whatsoever against hypersonic missiles. So we are essentially naked. And the war can be prosecuted, if you like, in that respect, in the way that Russia chooses to do so. Although I talked in the article about a sort of ramping up, I suspect that the Russians might be a little bit more, they might escalate in a way which suits them. So they may not go to destroy all of our energy infrastructure as a response to attacks on offensive air attacks by the West, but rather actually do it in an escalated way. And all the time saying to us that if you keep going, this is what we will do, and we can take out the whole of your energy infrastructure. And I can tell you, as having worked in the energy industry for the last 15 years, Europe won't survive that. Europe won't survive a destruction of its energy infrastructure because no industrial nation can. We're already seeing it in small scale in Germany, but the consequences would be profound. I talked in the article as well about the possibility of the Russians announcing a blockade, which is we're quite capable of doing because we don't have the anti-submarine warfare forces to defend against, at the moment, against Russian submarines. So even the threat of a blockade would probably turn the shipping companies off and the insurance companies off from delivering fuels to oil and refined products to our nations. I mean, the only 2 countries which would be not sort of immune from this, but more immune than others, is your country and mine, yours in particular, because Norway is independent for oil and gas, and to a lesser extent the UK, because we get about 47 or 48% of our oil and gas sold from the North Sea. But other than that, imagine what it's like when the lorries stop running, when the tractors, which rely critically on diesel, stop farming, when the fishing vessels, which rely critically on diesel, stop fishing. You can soon see that it doesn't take long for us to get into a perilous economic situation. And at that stage, I would expect us to see for peace. I would expect as well the Americans to be doing the very best they can to talk to both sides and bring this to a peace. But even after the peace is declared, Glenn, if the war plays out in this way, then I think that the consequences for Europe will be profound. Again, it depends how it goes, how long it goes on. I mean, the only open question, Glenn, and it's a really, really important open question, is what the British and the French do, both with nuclear deterrents. And that's a sort of binary decision, isn't it? Because actually, either the British and the French, one or other or both, can use those deterrents, but that's suicidal. That's the end of Britain, and it's the end of France, and probably the end of a lot of Europe. So, is Prime Minister Burnham or President Macron going to take suicidal action? I mean, it's not beyond comprehension, Clem, because we've seen such irrational actions from the Europeans so far. But it's a very, very scary thing. More likely, though, I would think, is that they will sue for peace, but still then have to pick up the consequences of the war after that peace happens. Now, those consequences could well play out over years, Glenn. So it's a long answer to your question, but I think the war, I would guess, if it doesn't escalate to a nuclear situation, will be fairly quick, because the Europeans are unable to defend themselves against attacks on their military facilities on the European mainland, and that's where I would expect Russia's focus to be, the military facilities, industrial facilities that support the military and the energy facilities, Glenn.
I think it's important what you said, though, that earlier you made the point that for the Russians, this is a defensive war. They've been warning since the 90s. You can't simply redivide the continent and then gradually remove those dividing lines and the NATO military infrastructure closer and closer to our borders. The problem is, within the acceptable analysis we have in Europe, you're not allowed to say this, that the Russians sees this as a defensive war, because then, it's justifying and, all this nonsense. But I think this is the problem, because in Europe, when we all had to commit to the narrative, oh, this was unprovoked, it came out of nowhere. Well, then you have to argue, well, why did the Russians decide to go to war? And the only answer then is, imperialism. They just want territory. And I think this also shapes what we expect from a war with Russia, because if we believe that this is just Russia waking up one day wanting new territory, then a war with Russia means this will be the objective. The Russians, for some reason, really wants to rule over Poland or Germany, nonsense. But this is essentially what the Europeans will then imagine a war being, which is why, the Dutch, they did exercises for how they could set up POW camps for Russian soldiers they would capture in Europe. And I was a bit amazed, because why would the Russians enter Europe? I mean, why would they? This is not a imperial war for territory. What the Russians want is to restore their deterrence. That is, for the Europeans to back off, stop launching drones and missiles into Russia, stop, doing it through Ukraine. It doesn't matter that, this is the war. So the purpose of the Russian war then would be, it needs to restore its deterrence, and also it would strike Europe before Europe is ready to strike Russia. And but none of this requires any Russian boots on the ground in any EU country. All it means is bombing out all the critical infrastructure across the European continent, create as much pain as possible, and of course the military industrial facilities, and that's it. But this should be obvious, but it's only obvious if you recognize that the Russians sees this as an existential threat. So, we can't even plan for a proper war, because we don't actually allow the analysis. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, and I completely agree, Glenn. I think this is why I come back to the quote of Clausewitz, which I'll read in a bit, Glenn. But I think that it's understanding the nature of the war is the Clausewitz said it's the most supreme judgment that a statesman and a military man can make. And I think what it also points to is a failure of strategic thinking. I will often quote General André Beaufort, a French general who wrote a book in 1956 called, I can't remember what it's about, strategy anyway, and I can send the details to you, Glenn. But he said, in war, the loser deserves, I'll paraphrase, in war, the loser deserved to lose, because his defeat will be consequences of failures of thinking either before or during the war. And, we've got a very good track record in the West in particular, and Europe especially, of failures of thinking.